China Global Television Network.
A bomb attack in Nigeria triggers suspensions of railway services between the nation's capital, Abuja, and the state of Kaduna. We find out from the UN the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia's Tigray after the latest airstrike. And EU leaders gather for a crucial summit amid fears that a row with Poland could overshadow crucial talks. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Nta, live in Nairobi, and for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. And tonight I'm alongside my colleague Penina, who has our business headlines. Penina.
Thank you, Richard. Coming up on Africa Live Business tonight, the third Turkey Africa Economic and Business Forum kicks off in Istanbul. And Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta signed several bilateral agreements with his Malawi counterpart. I'll have details of those stories and plenty more in just a bit. For now, I take you back to Richard.
Thank you so much, Penina. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. So good to have you with us for this hour. Let's begin in Nigeria, where the country's railway corporation has suspended train operations between the nation's capital, Abuja, and the northwest state of Kaduna. This follows a bomb attack that occurred on Wednesday night on the railway track. Our correspondent Tessa McKinday tells us more.
Managing Director of the Nigerian Railway Corporation, Engineer Fidet Okiria, has confirmed the explosion and says the suspension of the train services is for the safety of passengers and crew members. Railway officials did not say whether there were casualties, but train passengers say the attack occurred around Dutse and regional communities in Kaduna State. The explosive was allegedly planted by armed gunmen who shot at the train and its driver, but only succeeded in damaging part of the rail track and having the windshield of the train shattered. The Nigerian Railway Corporation says efforts are ongoing to ensure train services along the Kaduna-Abuja route are fully restored soon, while security operatives investigate the attack. Tessem Akende, CGTN, Jos, Nigeria.
Staying in Nigeria, local media have reported that more than 30 people have been abducted in northwest state of Niger. Kidnapping continues to be a major problem in parts of Nigeria's north, despite the government ordering security operatives to step up an offensive against the criminals. Correspondent Philly Haza reports in Abuja.
Gunmen reportedly stormed a highway in Rafi local government area, shooting indiscriminately before taking their victims to an unknown location. The victims are thought to have been people traveling to Niger State. The police there have yet to confirm the incident. The northwestern states in Nigeria, including Niger, Kaduna, Katsina, and Zamfara, have been under siege from criminals for months. More than 1,000 people have been kidnapped since late last year, mostly students in schools. The Kaduna state government says between July to September, 830 people were kidnapped, 343 others were killed, and 210 injured across the state in violent attacks by gunmen. The State Commissioner for Internal Security and Home Affairs, Samuel Aruwan, says security agencies have killed 69 criminals in various search and rescue operations. President Muhammadu Buhari has directed the heads of security to intensify their efforts in combing the possible hideouts of the criminals and rescue any victims still in captivity. Phil Ihaza, CGTN, Abuja.
Let's now go to Ethiopia, where the latest government airstrikes hit the Tigrayan capital, Mekele, on Wednesday for the second time this week. An army spokesman confirmed Wednesday's strike targeted facilities where Tigrayan forces repair armaments. No casualties was immediately reported. This week's strikes come after a fresh military offensive was launched against Tigrayan forces who have been fighting Ethiopian government and allied forces for nearly a year. The conflict has left thousands dead and over 2 million people displaced. All right, we have with us Saviano Abreu, the head of communications in Southern and Eastern Africa for the United Nations Organization for Humanitarian Affairs, ONUCHA. He joins us live via Zoom from Nairobi. Saviano, welcome to Africa Live. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us. Now, what is the humanitarian situation in Tigray now, and what are the most urgent needs of the people there?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for having me. The humanitarian situation in Tigray is actually extremely alarming. We have millions of people that are in need of humanitarian assistance, not only in Tigray, but also in Afar and Amara, the neighboring regions where we saw in the last days the intensification of the conflict as well. So if you can talk about main needs, I think food would be the most urgent needs of people in the region. We have up to 7 million people now that need food assistance, and we have more than 400,000 people in Tigray alone that are already in famine-like conditions. It means that without a proper assistance, without immediate assistance, these people are going to be facing imminent threats to their lives. So the situation is alarming, is dire. The United Nations and humanitarian partners are on the ground trying to do whatever we can to support people in need, but are facing challenges. And yeah, the humanitarian response is very, very difficult there now.
All right, Saviano Abreu, let's leave it there for now. Thank you so much for your insight and analysis. Much appreciated. Let's turn our attention now to Libya, where the country's unity government hosted senior foreign officials to drum up support on transitional issues plaguing the war-torn North African nation. The Thursday conference comes 2 months ahead of the planned presidential election. The United Nations-led peace process seeks to end a decade of conflict and chaos. Libya and the UN have been working to end the violence that has racked the country since 2011 when President Gaddafi was toppled. A ceasefire between rival Eastern and Western factions last year led to a unity government taking office in March this year. The unity government is mandated to take the country to elections originally slated for December. However, East-West wrangling has seen a delay in legislative polls, with a date to be set in the new year. Libya's foreign minister says Thursday's conference aims to gather the necessary support for the election in a transparent way. The two-day European Union Leaders Summit has kicked off in Brussels, but all officials are concerned that an explosive EU row with Poland over its rejection of some of the bloc's laws will overshadow the summit. The issue was eclipsing the original theme for the Brussels gathering, which was to examine how Europe can cope with the global energy crunch while sticking by ambitious green policies it will push at the COP26 climate summit in 2 weeks' time. EU officials speaking on condition of anonymity said the rule of law issue is so fundamental that battle lines being drawn around it have the potential to split the 27-nation bloc. In a sign of the alarm and rising tensions, key leaders hastily lined up one-on-one meetings with Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki just before the summit start. All right, moving on, our correspondent Jills Gibson joins us live from Brussels. Jills, welcome to Africa Live. Thank you also for taking the time to speak to us. Jills, a showdown expected over Poland. What's the latest from there?
Well, even in the days building up to this two-day summit here in Brussels, there were tense negotiations going on behind the scenes about whether Poland and this issue of the rule of law would even be on the agenda for this meeting. Eventually, we saw in the invitation letter that was sent, the official invitation letter that was sent by the European Council President Charles Michel, that this issue will be touched upon, but certainly there will be leaders who are in that room right now meeting here in Brussels who will want to do much more than just touch upon it. They'll want to discuss it in some detail. This entire dispute was really reignited this month when a Polish constitutional tribunal in Warsaw released this ruling, which caused a furious reaction from the European Commission here in Brussels. This ruling said that EU law does not take primacy over certain aspects of the Polish constitution. And that decision, it sounds a bit technical, but it's a real threat to one of the cornerstones of the European project and the EU's legal framework as it has worked for several decades now. However, heading into this meeting, there were allies of the Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki who were saying that this should not be on the agenda whatsoever. You had Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, saying that there is no need to have any sanctions, referring there to a possible response from the European Commission that we could see in the coming weeks. And he also called it ridiculous that these leaders are discussing this when there are clearly other pressing issues on their minds.
All right, important points that you've made there. Let's circle back a little bit and talk about the main agenda, which was expected to be energy prices, climate and migration matters, among others. What more should we expect, Jills?
Well, heading into the winter months here in Europe, there is a lot of concern about these two sort of overlapping crises, and that's rising energy prices and COVID-19, because, of course, we are expecting, or scientists and epidemiologists are expecting COVID-19 cases in Europe to rise in the coming months as people spend more time indoors. They are also expecting energy prices to have a real impact on people's pockets as they try to heat their homes through the coldest months of the year. We actually had a proposal going into this meeting from the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez saying that the European Union should buy and negotiate gas, natural gas, from countries like Russia jointly. The idea there is that potentially you could get a better price if you negotiate as a bloc, as a whole. One country in particular, Germany, has come out against that concept. And just mentioning Germany there, it's worth noting that German Chancellor Angela Merkel is going into her 107th EU summit, and this is almost certainly going to be her last one as she prepares to step down as German Chancellor.
All right, Jills Gibson, thank you for staying on top of that story for us. Great reporting as usual. On to Morocco now, where the country has effected its mandate for a COVID-19 vaccine pass to enter public places and travel. The mandate follows warnings issued by the country's health ministry of the threat of a new virus surge. On Monday, the health ministry stressed the need to avoid a possible relapse of serious and critical cases and COVID-19 related deaths witnessed in several European countries. The North African nation has the highest vaccination rates in Africa, with more than 50% of its population fully inoculated. Some people complained of long queues at vaccination centers following the announcement of the COVID-19 pass.
Of course, I am not against vaccination. I just did not have time to do it. I wanted to do the vaccination in the coming days, but currently the vaccination centers are very crowded. So I will wait between 20 days and a month to go for vaccination.
For me, imposing a vaccination passport is a good decision. This will make it easier for me to enter several places without being bothered by anyone.
We will make the effort with our clients to be in line with the decision and ask them to get this vaccine. We will make sure to do this, and we'll try and convince them in a good way.
South Africa has started vaccinating adolescents against COVID-19. The African nation is giving jabs to youngsters aged between 12 and 17 years. They will get just one dose of the Pfizer vaccine, and that's according to recommendations from the committee which advises the government on its COVID-19 strategy. South Africa is trying to increase its rate of vaccinations, which is running behind the target of 300,000 daily shots as it aims to inoculate at least another 6 million people against the virus. While children over 12 years of age may consent to their own medical treatment, the government has advised parents and guardians to accompany youngsters to vaccination sites.
And it's very important you get vaccinated so you don't get sick, very sick. Like I got last year very sick when I had COVID, and I don't want my kids to suffer the same way that I suffered.
I feel good because it won't really prevent me from getting COVID, but at least if I get it, the symptoms won't be as bad.
Our biggest encouragement for it was we lost many family members. I've lost a husband, she's lost a father. People need to get it.
The news continues on Africa Live. Time now for a short break. Here's what's ahead. Well, coming up, reports warns that Africa's glaciers will melt in the next 2 decades as poor people face drought, floods, and extreme heat. What can the continent do to avert climate catastrophe? Welcome back to Africa Live. Thanks for staying with us. A World Meteorological Organization report is warning of a possible three-tier impact caused by the effects of climate change in Africa. The continent's eastern glaciers are expected to melt in the next 2 decades. 118 million people will be at risk of drought, floods, or extreme heat, and Africa's economy could shrink by 3% by mid-century if current trends continue. CGTN's Joy Karuki brings us the details of the latest report by the WMO.
Africa is warming more and at a faster rate than the global average. These are some of the findings of the World Meteorological Organization report.
Glaciers are melting worldwide, and that's also the case when it comes to 3 African glaciers, Mount Kenya, Rwenzori, and Kilimanjaro. And you can see that there's been major loss of the sea ice area and also sea ice mass. And if the current trends continue, we won't see any glaciers in Africa in 2040s.
According to the WMO, croplands in Africa are largely drought-prone. Widespread poverty is making it harder for communities to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change.
The report highlights the urgency of the situation in a continent which, while constituting 17% of the global population, is responsible for less than 4% of greenhouse gas emission and has the least capacity to adapt to the impacts of a warming climate. We are launching this report in the middle of a very divergent recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, which has exposed the inequalities of the global system and the vulnerabilities of Africa.
The continent, which is heavily reliant on agriculture, is facing worsening drought, extensive flooding, and a locust infestation of historic proportions. The report estimates that sub-Saharan Africa needs to spend $30 to $50 billion each year on adaptation to avert even worse consequences.
Adapting to the impacts of climate change is costing African economies an average of 5% of their GDP. And if warming continues at the rates projected in this report, these costs will increase exponentially within the next decade.
Experts warn inaction could result in a decade of decline, insecurity, poverty, and continued vulnerability. Joy Kiruki Juma, CGTN.
Well, let's break it down a bit further. We have with us Francois Engelbrecht, a professor of climatology at the Global Change Institute, University of Wits. He joins us live via Zoom from Johannesburg. Mr. Engelbrecht, welcome to Africa Live. The warning is out. Africa's famous mountain glaciers melting more and more at a faster rate. In simple terms, what can the continent do with this information now that it is here?
Evening, Richard, and thanks so much for having me. Yes, the fact that we are losing these wonderful African landscapes in front of our eyes is, of course, just another warning signal for Africans and for African governments that climate change is already impacting in Africa. So climate change is something that will affect all of us in our own lifetimes. It's not something of the far future. It's already happening. And this report also points out that the impacts will strengthen and become even worse over the next 20 years. Now, in order to respond to climate change, we have to do mainly 3 things. Firstly, we need to understand what the risks are. So in every African country, we need to know which are the provinces or regions that are most prone to more occurrences of drought in a changing climate. Where are we most vulnerable in terms of heat waves becoming more intense? Where can we expect more frequent flooding? Once we know what the risks are, then of course we can take the next step, which is adapting to climate change. And there's a wide range of preventative measures we can take to soften some of these future impacts on our continent. Thirdly, of course, we need to find the adaptation funding. So very, very large investments are needed to help prepare Africa and to make Africa less vulnerable for these future climate change impacts across the continent.
All right, Professor Engelbrecht, let's talk about that a little more and unpack that. The report estimates that sub-Saharan Africa needs to spend about 30 to 50 billion US dollars each year on adaptation to avert even worse consequences. What are these adaptation measures being alluded to? Can you expand on that, sir?
Sure. Adaptation measures are very, very broad. They are measures that span implementations from the scale of very expensive government interventions to steps that communities and households can take to make themselves less vulnerable to climate change impacts. Let me give you some of the examples to make this concrete. Let's think, for example, of Mozambique. In Mozambique, in 2019, in March, we had tropical cyclone Idai impacting at Beira. It became the worst flood disaster we've ever seen in Africa south of the equator. And more than 1,300 people lost their lives in the flooding. And hundreds of people died in Beira just because of the so-called storm surge, that wall of seawater that comes from the ocean after it has been spun up by the cyclone and then move inland. Now, we can build seawalls at Beira. We can build a seawall at Maputo and make these two Mozambican cities much less vulnerable to the impacts of a storm surge coming from the ocean than these cities are right now. And we can save hundreds of lives. And we can save economic impacts in these eastern coastal cities along the African coast. So that is an example of a very expensive infrastructure investment that we can call an adaptation investment. Then, for example, just think about drought. African countries are so often impacted by drought. For example, right now we have the drought in southern Madagascar. In recent years, we had devastating droughts in Zimbabwe, in Botswana, in South Africa, in Namibia. And from time to time, we also have drought in West Africa and East Africa when the monsoon rains fail. Now, African countries need to become much better in, for example, supporting each other during times of drought by having better trade deals amongst African countries, by developing joint insurance schemes so that African countries through insurance schemes can support countries that have suffered losses in recent times through the support from countries that are doing better at a given moment in time. And climate helps us with this because it works in such a way that usually when Southern Africa have drought, it's going well in East Africa and the other way around. And we should become much better in food aid in African countries. For example, right now with the drought in Madagascar, one of the problems is that it is so difficult to reach the communities that need food aid. It's a very practical problem. And then at the level of communities, it's, for example, with municipalities helping communities that live below flood lines to find a new place to live in where they are less vulnerable to flash floods. We so often have mudslides in the eastern parts of Africa, East Africa and Southern Africa, killing people during times of floods. If we can move people away from the steep slopes where they are vulnerable to these mudslides from occurring, we can once again save tens of lives or save hundreds of lives. So you can see it really stretches from big things that government can do and that things that you can do within a community or municipality. The last thing I'll mention is that adaptation costs money. So I suspect that the Africa group in the negotiations coming up at the 26th conference of the parties are going to negotiate more strongly than ever before for large adaptation investments in Africa. Because we should remember, Africa is not in the first place the continent that is responsible for the problem of global warming. We need to contribute our fair share to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it's very important that the developed industrial countries that are most responsible for this problem will support the developing world, including Africa, through adaptation investments and adaptation funding, so that we can prepare as well as we can for the future impacts of climate change on the continent.
All right, Professor Francois Engelbrecht, thank you for sharing your perspective. Francois Engelbrecht, a professor of climatology at the Global Change Institute, University of Wits. Thank you so much for bringing all of that to light and, of course, sharing your perspective. Thank you so much. Let's turn our attention to South Sudan, where the government says It is investigating the death of a UN peacekeeper in the north of the country. The death of the Ethiopian national occurred during a protest which was demanding the relocation of peacekeeping troops in the northern Bahr el Ghazal state near the disputed Abyei area. CGTN's Patrick Oyet reports.
South Sudan's Foreign Affairs Ministry says it deeply regrets the loss of life of the United Nations peacekeeper. The peacekeeper was from one of the battalions of the United Nations Interim Force for Abyei, or UNISFA. UNISFA was originally deployed in the Abyei area located along the South Sudan-Sudan border. The area is claimed by both Sudan and South Sudan. Some troops from UNISFA were then deployed to a buffer zone created to try and avoid clashes between forces of Sudan and South Sudan. The peacekeeper was deployed in that buffer zone. The buffer zone is created as a result of an agreement between Sudan and South Sudan to have a 10-mile area along the border where troops of each country are not allowed to operate. Communities in the area were against the deployment of the UN peacekeepers. They accused the peacekeepers of demarcating the 10-mile zone using signs from Sudan. The local community say demarcating the area using signs from Sudan and using Arabic language could be interpreted that they are part of Sudan. It was during a demonstration by the local community against the UN troops deployed in the area that the peacekeeper was killed. South Sudan's government says it is now investigating the matter. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
Education authorities in Sudan's capital have cut school hours and reduced the number of lessons per day, citing a shortage of bread. The director of basic education in Khartoum State, Hamza Ahmed Mohammed Al-Fahal, said they will keep shorter hours at school until the situation improves. Naba Muhyiddin has more from Khartoum.
Due to shortages of bread in Sudan, the schools will now only be open in the morning from 7:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. Authorities have also declared the number of lessons should not exceed 4 periods a day. Parents have condemned the government's decision.
Yes, we are suffering from the bread issue, and it is affecting us. We can't make meals for the children to take with them, but we can look for alternatives like pasta or rice. It's not a reason to make such a surprising decision. It'll negatively affect the schedule of the academic year.
The shortages are linked to the protests in eastern Sudan, where demonstrators have blocked roads and ports, preventing the transportation of food to the rest of the country. The protesters belong to the Beji community, which has accused the government of political marginalization and subjecting them to poor economic conditions. School-age children have already suffered a delay of 2 years due to the political change that followed al-Bashir ouster in 2019 and COVID-19 global pandemic in 2020. Schools were shut throughout that time.
Our children had already suffered enough instability. They can't bear another delay. It's psychologically harming them and us as parents.
School principals like Dr. Haidar Al-Ghadi are urging the government to reconsider the decision.
For schools to start at 7 a.m. and end at 11 a.m. is a rushed decision. It'll affect our plans to complete this year and to compensate last year's delay for the students. I wish the authorities to reconsider this decision and to separate political considerations from education.
The government said the decision will last till the shortages issue is resolved.
Many Sudanese are desperate for political solutions to resolve their economic hardships. They say they can't afford to see their children fall behind and suffer as well. They urgently want them to finish the academic school year. Naba Muhyiddin, CGTN, Khartoum, Sudan.
The Egyptian Council of State took a landmark step by appointing women judges for the first time since its founding. 98 women were sworn in on Tuesday to serve on one of the country's top judicial bodies. Here's Adel El-Mahroui with more.
It's a major leap for women empowerment in Egypt's judiciary system. 98 women judges took oath this week to be delegates or deputies on the nation's Council of State. They are not going to be judges just yet. They have, however, officially begun a career that should see them sit on the bench of one of the most prestigious judicial bodies in the country.
I consider myself extremely lucky as I witnessed one of the most important moments in the history of Egyptian women's struggle. After more than 70 years, today, Egyptian women become members of the Council of State.
All of these women were already working in other judicial bodies. The Council of State stipulates that all its members must have no violations on the record during their legal career. They must be among the top-graded students in their law schools, and a master's degree or advanced graduate diplomas in law are also required.
It is an honor for us to be the first women who get accepted into the Council of State. It was a long selection process that began months ago. We applied, submitted our documents, had multiple interviews, and finally received a decree from the Egyptian president for the appointment.
The Council of State is a judicial body established in 1946 to look into state administrative issues which the government is involved. Since its founding, its board had always ruled against allowing women into their court. Earlier this year, the Supreme Council for Judicial Bodies, led by President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, made the historic decision of allowing women in the Council of State and the Prosecutor General's office.
While appointing 98 women judges in the Council of State has been widely celebrated, there is still a long way ahead for women in judicial authority. There are about 22,000 judges in Egypt, but according to the National Women Council, there are only 66 women judges. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
All right, time now for our business segment with Panina. Over to you, Panina.
Thank you, Richard. Coming up on Africa Live Business. The third Turkey-Africa Economic and Business Forum kicks off in Istanbul. And Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta signs several bilateral agreements with his Malawi counterpart.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
The third Turkey-Africa Economic and Business Forum kicked off in Istanbul today. Many high-level officials as well as business leaders from Turkey and Africa attended the meetings. CGTN's Mikhail Bardavid has the details.
The main aim of the two-day forum is to discuss and strategize ways to deepen Turkey-Africa partnerships in trade, technology, investments, and logistics. This was also the title of the first ministerial meeting of the event that took place behind closed doors. Other session topics were focused on collaboration between Turkey and Africa on agriculture and agro-industries. A joint communique was published where participants agreed to encourage the private sector to invest in various industries such as tourism, aviation, maritime, and education. Sustainable health partnerships in post-COVID times were also debated, as the forum also underlined the need for increased supply of COVID-19 vaccines to African countries. B2B meetings took place in the afternoon, aiming to increase interaction between business communities and to initiate dialogue between Turkish investors, the African Union, and the African regional economic communities. On the second day of the forum, women leadership dialogue, trade financing in Africa, and banking relations with Turkey will be among the main topics of discussion. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is also expected to give a closing speech on Friday. I'm Mikhail Bardavid for CGTN in Istanbul.
Malawi's President Lazarus Chakwera's state visit to Kenya has borne fruit. The two nations have furthered bilateral ties by signing 8 new agreements designed to strengthen their socio-economic bonds. The agreements covered broad areas of cooperation between Kenya and Malawi, including in politics, diplomacy and defense. President Kenyatta said collaboration and consolidation of ties between the two countries would guarantee socio-economic growth benefiting their citizens and the African continent as a whole, and called for effective implementation of the newly signed agreements.
Today, we held the 3rd Kenya-Malawi Joint Permanent Commission for Cooperation. The JPCC is an important mechanism for strengthening our relations and unlocking the unlimited political, social, economic, and diplomatic potential of our countries for the benefit of our peoples.
It is no small thing that we have successfully agreed to and signed 8 instruments of cooperation in defense, diplomacy, health, cooperatives, tourism, agriculture, and other areas for the mutual benefit.
Nigeria's headline inflation dropped to 16.63% in the month of September this year from the 17.01% recorded in August. The most closely watched index, which is food inflation, dropped to 19.57% in September from 20.3% recorded in the prior month. CGTN's Deji Bademosi has more on that story.
This is the 6th consecutive decline that Nigeria would be recording since April, after the inflation rate peaked at 18.17% in January this year. But the rate of moderation in the inflation figures have been slow and not far-reaching. Prices of goods and services are still very high and beyond the reach of many.
We are talking about just less than 1% drop in the inflation rate. So the drop was very marginal. And inflation rate, I'm talking of headline inflation now, at 16.63% is still very, very high. If there is any complaints around the economy today among the economic players and among the citizens, the complaints are about inflation, the high prices of goods and services. So that speaks to the fact that there is still a whole lot that we need to do as far as inflation is concerned.
Nigeria's inability to attract enough foreign exchange has proven to be a challenge for the economy. Items listed in the core inflation report, which rose by 13.74% in September, depend heavily on scarce forex for importation.
The depreciation in the exchange rate has taken a huge toll on prices across practically all product groups. We are now talking about exchange rate of 5.70, 5.75. I think that is quite significant, and that is taking a huge toll on prices, both on core inflation and on food inflation. Then we have challenges of liquidity in the foreign exchange markets. Even accessing foreign exchange, especially in the official window, has remained a major challenge. That is affecting the capacity of manufacturers to access raw materials, and therefore affecting their capacity utilization, and therefore affecting their outputs. And you know, when we have challenges on the supply side, it has implications for inflation.
Food inflation has continued to rise since 2019, when Nigeria closed some of its land borders to control smuggling and recoup lost revenue. Despite reopening its borders, the price of food items is yet to record appreciable decline.
Security is a major problem around food inflation, especially because of the impact of insecurity on agricultural production. Most of the farmers that are supposed to be on their farm, cultivating, harvesting, planting, and all of that, many of them are afraid to go to farm. Many of them are currently in IDP camps. So this is taking a huge toll also on food inflation. Then we have the challenge of high transaction costs at the ports. Getting goods in and out of the port, particularly Lagos ports, has become a very, very difficult thing. This is also contributing to inflation because the high transaction costs will have to be transferred ultimately to the final consumers.
The government has an ambitious plan to bring the inflation rate down to 13% by 2022. For now, though, the biting inflation is eroding people's purchasing power. If the figures do not decline appreciably and quickly, it might be only a matter of time before labor unions in the country begin to push for a raise in wages. Jpmorgan, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
The momentum in trade conditions in South Africa, temporarily interrupted in July, appears to be recovering, but only at a moderate pace. Conditions remain in negative territory, with the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry Trade Activity Index standing at 39. CGTN's Angela Kupla has this story.
The current index level is 39, which is very concerning. The mid-level data point is actually 50.
The level of 39, I think, for the index, which is in negative territory, as we would call it, is still a very negative figure. It actually implies that about 60% of your people in the trade environment and of the respondents are still viewing trade as not very good.
While sales volumes improved, they remained depressed, with new orders declining in September. The effects of the riots were still being felt.
Of course, we had that developments in July that had a main impact on your traders, especially, and international as well as local trade in certain areas of the country, where because of your linkage effects, it actually filtered through into the total trade environment. So not very good, and that actually had a sort of setback on the trade conditions to see it actually dwindle a bit up to where we are now.
The negative trade conditions are more pronounced in the retail sector, but there's an additional concern.
What we're seeing in terms of trade, especially retail trade, that we know was actually negative year on year in August, indicates to us, that there's something also happening to your consumer, your consumer spending, your disposable income, discretionary expenditure, type of thing.
There was a sector that did perform well despite the bottlenecks at some of the country's harbours.
In terms of international trade problems at the harbours at the moment, to some extent, which was a positive to a certain extent, very positive actually, in terms of your merchandise goods. But also that, had some setbacks to some extent, and the July sort of disruptions had quite an effect on international trade, especially in August and July. And those motor trade, of course, was one of the positives, which is up on year, month on month, and so on.
The economic outlook in the short term is fairly muted, however.
At the moment, the respondents expect, conditions to improve a bit into positive territory in the next 6 months. We know the holiday season is coming up, Christmas holidays, Christmas time. That might help a bit, to ease some of the pressure on the trade environment.
Trade conditions don't look very favourable for South Africa for the next 6 months, and it seems like companies and businesses are going to be muddling along until things turn around. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Egypt has finally been allowed back into the Jpmorgan Emerging Markets Government Bond Index after a 10-year absence. According to Jpmorgan, this step would give access for the government to gain up to $2.4 billion in returns for its local currency bonds market. The North African country had been dismissed from the index due to the economic fallout following the uprising in January 2011. CGTN's Yasser Hakim has this story.
Egypt has tried for the last 3 years to rejoin the index after being removed in 2011, and the review by the benchmark specialized in emerging markets government bonds has finally yielded positive results.
The condition to return to the index was to maintain a steady increase in liquidity, with abilities for larger bond issuances. There must be more foreign investments in the bonds, and they need to be issued at longer shelf lives of up to 20 years. This has been met. At this time, we need a strong purchaser of Egyptian bills, and joining Jpmorgan will allow for big sales.
Egypt has been aggressively tapping international debt tools as it rebuilds an economy shattered by years of political turmoil. The central bank says external debt has exceeded $134 billion in June 2021, and Jpmorgan Index will open the door for more finance.
The issuance of Egyptian treasuries next January will allow Egypt, which has a weight of 1.85% on the index, to receive investments of up to $10 to $12 billion. This amount gives an incentive to the Egyptian economy to sustain the upcoming global volatility and rising inflation. Egypt will be able to keep interest rates stable or even drop slightly without any pressure on the central bank or the foreign exchange rate.
Jpmorgan confirmed that Egypt's government bonds in the local currency with a total value of $16 billion are eligible for the index, and the Ministry of Finance has confirmed it will begin with an equivalent $1 billion issuance in early 2022. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
A Ghanaian shoemaker has found a way of using wine corks to make fashion accessories. He wants to contribute to the growing trend of sustainable fashion with his eco-friendly footwear. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
Stephen Sapon started his shoe business with leather. He began exploring wine cork as an alternative material 2 years ago. The corks are processed into sheets like this and then sewn together with leather to produce the footwear.
We source them from the local market. It's not only the cork, we also use the sawdust as well. So it's abundantly available. It's only the cork that we cannot get them in full supply.
Stephen collects the corks from hotels and restaurants in Accra, but the supply of his raw material fell when the COVID-19 pandemic forced the shutdown of the hospitality industry last year.
We ended up also importing some of the cork and just recycling them and using them in the sheet form to make our products.
Unlike developed countries where the concept of upcycled fashion is not new to many people, Ghanaians are now only getting used to the idea.
Early stage, you have to do much education, which happens to every business. It's new to this part of our region, and we've known leather as being quality, as being sustainable and all that. But you still need to go down to the people, just let them know the importance or the need for us to have eco-friendly footwear.
While his shoes have attracted buyers from the UK and Canada, Stephen wants to boost interests across Africa. He is looking to tap into the African Continental Free Trade Area platform, which is aimed at boosting intra-African trade for 1.3 billion people, and he uses social media platforms like Facebook to advertise his products. Stephen says his shoes are 30% leather and 70% cork. A pair like this costs $50. Stephen Sapon has trained more than 100 young people in shoemaking using processed corks and hopes to reduce the total dependence on leather, one shoe at a time. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Well, that's it for now, but later in Global Business, we'll be looking at how Moody's downgrade of Ethiopia's credit rating will affect the country's economy. That's at the top of the hour, and I shall see you then. For now, we're taking a short break. Richard will be back with more news.
China's coastal industrial centers see new potential, with manufacturing flourishing by the sea. From protecting the ocean environment to boosting the marine economy, new innovations seek sustainable development. Along the coast of the Yellow Sea and the Bohai Sea, CGTN presents Tides of Change Part 3, our ultimate trip to discover a promising future.
Welcome back to Africa Live. Ethiopia's top university announced that it has finished all preparations to launch a master's degree program in the Chinese language. The MA in teaching Chinese to speakers of other languages will be offered with the help of the university's Confucius Institute. Here is CGTN's Gurung Chala with more.
The move by Addis Ababa University to open a master's degree program in the Chinese language is intended to strengthen the people-to-people ties between Ethiopia and China. The university intends to enroll students in the next few months. This makes Addis Ababa University the first higher academic institution to provide masters in the Chinese language in the Eastern African region. Already the university has been offering a bachelor's degree in the Chinese language for a few years now. Addis Ababa University's Academic Affairs Vice President said The master's program is approved by the University Senate, which has endorsed all curriculum needed. A university in China has also been offering Ethiopia's Amharic language as a full degree since 2020. The program is based on a cooperative agreement between Addis Ababa University and Beijing Foreign Studies University. Ethiopia and China have comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership in almost all sectors. Grumchala CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Time now for our sports segment. Here's what's ahead. Uganda beat Ethiopia